Welcome to Blueprint Boost for Contractors, the podcast that's your go-to source for unlocking the secrets to successful marketing, gaining valuable insights, and growing your contracting business with less stress. Your host is David Brooks, and he's thrilled to be your guide on this journey. As a seasoned expert in the contracting industry, David understands the challenges you face. That's why each episode is crafted to provide you with actionable strategies and proven blueprints to boost your business to new heights.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the podcast. I'm your host, David Brooks. We have a returning guest with us, and I'll allow him to introduce himself.
Hey everybody, this is Anthony Maynor with Righttek HVAC Training. Glad to be back on and appreciate the opportunity, David.
No, thanks. We're glad to have you back on, Anthony.
Excellent, excellent.
So before we dive into today's topic, can we just get a high-level overview of what exactly are A2L refrigerants and why it's such a hot topic right now in the HVAC world?
Yeah, absolutely. So the government basically put in a plan, part of what's called the AIM Act, connected with the EPA regulations for refrigerants, and effective the beginning of this year, January 1st of 2025, all newly manufactured heating and air conditioning systems have to use a refrigerant that has a lower GWP or global warming potential value. And so the new threshold for that value is a number of 700. So the lower the number, the better for the environment, the higher the number, the worse. And R-410A, which of course we've been using for the last 15 to 20 plus years now, has a GWP of almost 2100. So it's nearly three times the new legal limit, if you will. So the manufacturers and everybody in our industry has been working on this for a number of years. They've come up with these new, what we call A2L or low GWP refrigerants that meet the new federal guidelines. And again, this year was kind of the transition time to these new systems and refrigerants. And everybody's just been scrambling, trying to get some training, get some education, figure out, what to do with these new systems and refrigerants, what's different, what's the same. So just been a very dynamic time in our industry.
Yeah, it's definitely been changing and really a hot topic to keep up with. And
Yes.
understanding that, this is where things are heading. Let's get into some of the understanding of it and some of the safety concerns too as well, because we want everyone to be safe and know and be aware of everything as things are progressing. So A2L refrigerants are known to be slightly flammable. Can you break down what that really means in practical terms for techs and homeowners?
Well, I'll certainly take my best stab at it here. So, what I always try to tell, particularly the technical side of this, audience is when we think about a flammable gas like propane, natural gas, those are the things that immediately come to people's minds because that's the stuff we work around every day in this industry. And most technicians, installers have watched a gas furnace ignite and light off or some other appliance. And we all kind of have a perception in our mind of how flammable those gases are. The A2Ls are nowhere near that degree of flammability. They are flammable, but under a different set of circumstances, if you will. So, what I always try to relate this to is to have any form of combustion, we've got to have three things present. We've got to have the gas, which in this case would be the refrigerant, right? If there's a leak, the gas accumulates. We've got to have an ignition source and we've got to have an adequate amount of oxygen in the air to mix with that gas in order to make it a combustible mixture. In other words, it's not the gas by itself that's combustible, it's the mixture of gas and oxygen in the right proportions that make it combustible. And if that mixture then meets that requirement and reaches a flame or a source of ignition, then, Houston, we have liftoff. That's where things happen. So when we talk about something like a flammable gas and try to relate it to these new refrigerants, always try to emphasize to folks that the new refrigerants have slight or limited flammability compared to what we're used to, like propane natural gas type flammability, in the sense that, first off, it takes a much higher percentage of gas to oxygen to mix together before it becomes a flammable mixture. And number two, it takes a hotter source of ignition than what we might need for something like propane to ignite, for example, to make that mixture ignite. So from a safety standpoint on job sites, I always try to tell people in my trainings and classes across the country, probably one of the best things that you can do preemptively to keep yourself safe when you're working around these types of systems, particularly if you're in a confined space. So maybe you're in a closet, a utility room, a sealed crawl space, a tight sealed attic type environment, is ventilate. Take a fan and just force some air to keep moving and dissipating any potential leakage that could occur in that space, keep dissipating it with good ventilation. And realistically, it should never have an opportunity to accumulate up to the percentages needed to become a flammable mixture. And that should be one of the number one safety things we can do that's a little different than what we might think about now in the field, just to keep good fresh air moving through the space, and more importantly, to prevent the accumulation of any of these vapors that could potentially leak or be leaking out into that space for whatever reason, whether it be an unintentional release or just a byproduct of servicing one of these systems after we've pumped it down or recovered it, we cut into the pipes. There's always a little bit of residual vapors hanging around there, and we just want to make sure that we ventilate well, David. And that really should be probably the most important thing that I could emphasize, along with, of course, having a fire extinguisher nearby for obvious reasons that we should have already. That should really make a big difference to avoid the flammable issues with these gases.
So no, that's really helpful because we want everybody to be safe and especially when you're dealing with flammable materials, we definitely want the techs to come home at the end of every day and we want the homeowners
Yes.
to feel secure as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. And reaching back to that topic, I always try to tell folks at the beginning and the end of many of my in-person classes, it's like this is a world different in terms of flammability from something like propane, for example, or natural gas, or what we normally think about. But one of the key things to keep in mind is really working with the refrigerants, installing these systems is no different than what we do today, and it's no different than what we've done our entire careers in this industry. It's just that we need to be a little bit more mindful of the fact that these gases do have slightly flammable properties. So ventilate well, don't ever unintentionally or unintentionally, allow any significant quantities of refrigerant to leak or escape, especially in a confined type of space. And really, it's going to be business as usual from an everyday in the field working standpoint. But I just don't want people to let their guard down because these refrigerants are so easy to work with that they forget that there are some flammable attributes that could, in the wrong circumstances, bite us. So we want to make sure we're aware of the safety protocols and just that we implement maybe some minor new safety things in our day-to-day activities to help, avoid the potential of a flammable event happening.
Mm. No, excellent breakdown. We appreciate that. Now,
Absolutely.
now there are two different main refrigerants replacing R410A and then R32 and R/454B. Can you walk us through the differences between the two?
Absolutely. So, in summary, we've been using 410A for a long time now. I mean, it became the refrigerant of choice back in the late 2009-10 time frame, and some brands had been using it even prior to that. But because of the high global warming potential, that one is now in the phase down window. We can no longer produce new equipment that uses 410A refrigerant. So the new refrigerants that all the manufacturers have aligned with moving forward are what we refer to again as A2Ls, and those are R32 and R454B. So we got not just one, but two new refrigerants coming into the industry literally as we speak. And these are the things that we need to get used to and get up to speed with, if you will. As far as handling and working with these refrigerants, it's pretty much business as usual again, based on what we've been used to doing with R-410A and even R-22 for the guys that have been around longer in this industry and we're used to working with that. But let me describe some of the key differences between them from a handling, a refrigerant charging type standpoint. R-454B is a blended refrigerant, just like R-410A was or is a blended refrigerant. So a couple of things to keep in mind when working with any blended refrigerant is number one, you always want to charge it in the liquid state. So we invert our disposable cylinders to make sure that we're keeping it, coming through the hoses, if you will, in a liquid form. And that helps to ensure that the blend, the two different refrigerant chemicals that are blended together to make this mixture of 454B remain intact in the correct proportions, if you will. So again, very similar to what we've always done with R410A. We just want to prevent it from fractionating. That's the fancy word they use, where the chemicals that make up the blend could separate. So again, out in the field, just invert your tanks just like you've always done with 410A and charge as usual, and you should be in very good shape there. R32, on the other hand, is actually a single compound refrigerant. It is not a blended refrigerant, and it's more like R22 was. For those of you that have been around long enough to remember working with that, we could charge it in the liquid state, but it wasn't mandatory. We could charge it as a vapor, charge it as a liquid. There was no risk or concern of it fractionating, if you will, or separating its components out because it is a single compound blend. So pretty much business as usual. Just keep in mind that 454B, being that it is a blend, should always be charged in the liquid state. R32 is probably the easier of the two to work with in the sense that it really doesn't matter with that. We don't have to worry about the blend separating or any of that because it's not a blend. The other question I get a lot of, David, relating to the new refrigerants versus 410A is what kind of pressures are we going to expect to see now? Is it going to be similar to 410A? Is it going to be like R22, or is it going to be even a higher pressure than what we've been experiencing with 410A? And the answer is it's virtually identical to R410A. So, from a practical standpoint, if you look at a pressure temperature chart for either of those refrigerants and you compare them to R410A, they're within a couple of PSI of each other based on any given temperature. So pretty much going to see the same exact range of pressures that you've been used to with 410A systems with both R32 and R454B. So hopefully that's good news for everyone as well.
Yeah, we definitely, want the positive news.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's always good stuff.
Right. So now that we know the differences, which manufacturers are moving toward standardizing, the R32 and R554B?
Well, so I'm going to give you kind of a short summary that could have a slight, hiccup here or there to it, but it's going to pretty much be what people need to hear. So most of all the major manufacturers have gravitated to R454B. The only very major and notable exception to that big picture is your Daikin branded products. So, Daikin, of course, is the company that manufactures Goodman, Amana, Daikin. Those are all three major residential, like commercial name brand products that we see, lots and lots of product out there in America and in the industry. So they are using R32. Everybody else, so Train, Rheem, Lennox, Bosch, all your other major manufacturers are switching over to R454B. So big picture, that's kind of the major breakdown that you're going to see across most of the unitary units that we're seeing out there in production, for residential like commercial applications.
Well, we appreciate that.
Hmm?
N- But on the flip side of that, we heard it's a slight shortage. Is that true?
Well, you had to bring that one up. So, yes, yes, yes. So there have been some growing pains here very recently, actually. And I think part of our challenge here is the fact that, you know, there was anticipation that folks would maybe hang on to some 410A inventory and we wouldn't burn through it quite as quickly because manufacturers could produce it all the way up to December 31st of 2024. But most manufacturers started to slowly make the shift and transition to the A2Ls, generally speaking around late summer, early fall, September-ish, October timeframe of last year, just to have a chance to make this transition smoothly, go through for everybody. Well, unfortunately, contractors, being a former contractor myself, we're creatures of habit. So largely a lot of folks just kept buying 410, 410, 410, and we have burned through so much inventory of 410A products that were manufactured prior to the deadline that it's really forced the industry over to the A2Ls a lot faster than anticipated. And when you couple that with the fact that the summer's coming on, people are getting busier and busier, there's very limited inventory of 410A product available in warehouses from most of the major distributors that I've seen and talked to and done trainings for across at least the mid-Atlantic states. So we've just run into a bit of a crunch time. Plus, R-454B is a new refrigerant, so it doesn't have the production track record, the global supply chain track record that 410A has, or even R-32, because R-32 products have been made and sold all over the world since probably about 2012 now. So there's hundreds of millions of R-32 systems. So the supply chain on the R-32 side is much more established. So they're not having an issue there. But again, when we're talking about 454B being a new refrigerant, being that so many major manufacturers have selected that as the refrigerant of choice, and being that contractors are in some cases starting to panic buy, they're finding out, oh, there's a shortage of refrigerant. Let me buy a whole bunch of it instead of just what I need to get through the next week or month. And it's really just putting a pinch on the industry right now. So there's a lot of folks hard at work on this, and there's some anticipation that here towards late summer that's going to get straightened out and that we're going to be in a better place. A lot of the manufacturers are beginning to ramp up the production to make sure that they can kind of keep up with this demand right now. But it is a little bit of a pinch. It's a little bit of a growing pain that everybody's feeling with the availability of 454B. Now, kind of hats off here to the most of the major OEMs because throughout this crunch that we're feeling right now, what a lot of them have done is they're beginning to pre-charge their units with additional refrigerant. So check with your manufacturer now. Don't take it from me, but check with your manufacturer. But most of them are getting to add more refrigerant into their outdoor units when they leave the factory to accommodate longer line set lengths so that hopefully most of our typical installation job line set links, we're not going to need extra refrigerant to add to those. So that'll hopefully save us from having to use so much of the new stuff that we've got in our cylinders and save that little bit for the jobs that really need it, the extra long line sets or maybe a service and repair job or something of that nature.
Ooh, well, excellent. So, I mean, hopefully, moving forward, that shortage and things could be shored up and we could move on to a heavier supply for things.
Absolutely. And I think all the key players in the industry are working very hard and diligently at this right now. But I think it was just an unpredictable or at least a underpredicted demand, I should probably say. And it's just been a lot of things that lined up very quickly here. And we're all feeling the pinch right now, that's for sure. But again, a lot of the major OEMs have kind of doubled down on the amount of refrigerant they're putting in. So instead of sending you a unit that's pre-charged for maybe 10 or 15 feet of refrigerant line, maybe now they're sending you enough for 25 to 30 feet of refrigerant line, which is a more typical installation for, particularly for most residential homes, for example. So I think they're doing the best they can under the circumstances to try to make this as navigable as possible.
Mhm. Now, on the installation and repair side, what are the most critical things that techs need to watch out for when working with these ATL refrigerants?
Absolutely. Great question. And I would say probably one of the number one most important things for techs and installers to know about is the requirement to have what's called mitigation controls installed on these new systems. Now, the good news is when you buy a unit from a major OEM that's an A2L unit, normally they have already factory installed the mitigation control board and the what we call the refrigerant detection or leak sensor, which is always going to be located at your indoor coil location, either in your air handler or in the evaporator case coil section, if you will. One of the key things here that installers in particular need to know about is depending upon the orientation of how they install that unit. In other words, do they install it as an upflow, horizontal left, a horizontal right, a downflow application? In most cases, you got to break out the manual. It's going to recommend, or it's not going to recommend, it's going to mandate that you relocate the sensor to the appropriate location per that manufacturer's installation instructions. And the general idea is that the sensor needs to be moved down to a low location based on the orientation of that coil. So, in other words, it kind of sits down low towards the bottom of the coil. And the reason for that is if there is a refrigerant leak that occurs in that indoor coil environment, refrigerants are heavier than air when they leak in a non-ventilated, non-windy environment. So we need that sensor to be down low where it will pick up the concentration of leaking refrigerant the soonest so that it could trigger this control that we call a mitigation safety control to go into a mitigation mode. And what mitigation means is if this leak descent, this detector we're talking about, senses the refrigerant leaking, it says, uh-oh, we've got a problem. What it's going to do is it's going to turn off the outdoor unit so that the pressures will potentially subside a little bit to minimize the rate of leak. And it's going to crank up the indoor blower to your cooling fan speed. So think high speed fan. That way we take and we dissipate those refrigerant vapors out through the duct system into the entire volume of home or building served by that duct system. Now, when I first say that, a lot of people cringe. They're like, whoa, wait a minute now, Anthony, you're telling me we're going to take flammable gases and we're going to blow them into the house or into the building where the people are? Yeah, because think about what we're doing here. We'll go back to something I mentioned earlier. In order to have combustion, we have to have three things present. We've got to have gas mixed with oxygen in the right percentages, and then a source of ignition, such as a flame or something hot enough to ignite that mixture. Well, here's the thing. When you talk about the A2L refrigerants, it takes a much higher percentage of gas to oxygen mixed before they become combustible. Roughly 12 to a little over 14% gas to air before we'll hit that flammable mixture, if you will, which is significantly more than what you would experience with something like propane, which only takes about 2% gas to air. But here's the deal. When we're talking about a coil or an air handler cabinet, when the fan is not on, it's all closed up. That's basically like a confined space, right? It doesn't take a lot of leakage to build up in concentration and potentially hit that flammable mixture limit. So instead of allowing that to happen, this leak detector is going to sense the refrigerant concentration. It's going to say, uh-oh, we've got a leak. Let's go into mitigation mode. So as a safety measure, it's going to crank up the blower, dissipate those vapors out amongst the entire volume of air served by that system, right? So that's a huge volume of air. It may be 10, 20, 30,000 cubic feet of volume in a home or a building, and the percentage of gas to oxygen goes way down. So we stay way below the lower flammability limit, and therefore it's never going to be flammable. So it's actually a important safety mechanism to make sure that we don't ever run into a situation where there could be a potential ignition hazard. So bottom line, to kind of get back after that long explanation to your question, is from an installer standpoint, it's critical that we open up the manual, follow the directions to relocate that refrigerant leak sensor to the proper place in the cabinet based on the orientation of installation. And then part two, make sure that we follow the instructions for proper wiring so that we wire everything correctly so that it will be able to respond as it's supposed to.
Nice. That's a beautiful breakdown and explanation. And it brings us into you're talking about proper wiring, but can we get into now all of the units will require a red tag or warning label? What's the purpose of these?
Well, so yeah, so basically anywhere you would go to put your gauges on a unit. So any of our service ports, which are typically at the outdoor unit for most residential, like commercial units, if you will, they are required, the manufacturers are required to have some form of a weatherproof tag hanging around those connection ports. It's pretty big. It's got to extend at least 1 inch in either dimension away from that port. So it's not just a tiny little mark. I mean, it's a fairly notable indicator so that when we walk up to a unit, particularly as service technicians, and we don't really know what gas is in there, what refrigerant's in there, if we see these red tags, or in the case of certain manufacturers, they've actually gotten what they're using is a red cap. So the service caps that we put on there to keep, the Schrader cores from leaking out if there was ever a problem and protect it from damage or theft, they're using a red cap, and it's a big red cap. It's about 1 inch long. It just screws right on. Some of them are using a big, like a heavy plastic just literally a disc, like maybe 2 inches in diameter with a little hole in the middle that just snaps on right around where you would hook your gauge up on those service ports. But what a lot of folks I'm learning are not staying up to speed on with these is those tags are mandatory. So UL, who has a lot to do with the certification and the standards that all our manufactured equipment, is required to comply with, they mandate that there be a red identifier at all the service ports so that a technician, an installer, somebody walking up to work on this unit will see red and say, whoa, okay, pay attention. I'm potentially dealing with a flammable based refrigerant in this system. One of the big things that we've been encountering down in my region of North Carolina, we've been doing a lot of training, not just for contractors, but also for building and mechanical inspectors across the state to get them up to speed on this. And a lot of what I'm hearing from both inspectors and contractors is they're showing up and the tags are missing, or their installers are thinking it's just there as a shipping item and they're pulling them off and throwing them away, and then they're failing their inspection. So number one, make sure that those tags remain intact. That is a critical thing. Another thing that's important for installers and service techs is that these units, because of the UL standards, require the installer to write down the total amount of refrigerant in that system. So in other words, on a split system, we've got the data plate amount given by the manufacturer, but we may have a longer line set than what that manufacturer included for on the amount they gave us on the data tag. So we add refrigerant. So the new standard requires us to write this on the label of that outdoor unit and document it. So most major OEMs have a big weatherproof label stuck right on the outside of the outdoor unit that has some spaces for you to fill this in. And from an installer, service tech, contractor standpoint, it's important to understand that the pen that we use to fill these out be a weatherproof type of ink or material, if you will. So a lot of folks like to just break out a Sharpie, but Sharpies are generally not approved for outdoor weather UV exposure type applications. Anybody in this industry for any length of time knows that it'll fade away pretty quick. And a couple of years, you can't even see what was written there anymore. So we need to use something more permanent, such as a paint pen, a paint marker, something that's oil-based that is designed for outdoor weather and UV exposure. So those are two key points I'll mention there from a installer standpoint, service tech standpoint, we need to be aware of. And then the other thing is proper wiring of the mitigation control board that we just talked about a few minutes ago. There's really two major groups of manufacturers, if you will, and in terms of how they have us do the low voltage wiring to the mitigation control. So to make this simple, since we don't have pictures here on a podcast, what I'm going to recommend to everybody is the first few A2L systems that you go out to install, you really need to open up the service manual, the installation manual, find the section on low voltage wiring. It's not hard, I promise. None of this is hard, but follow the guidance for how to properly wire it. And after you've wired your first unit or two from any given brand, then you got it. You probably don't need that diagram every time, just like today. We pretty well know how to do our low voltage wiring. It's just that it's changing a little bit. And you're going to see differences. You're going to see that maybe Goodman, Lennox, York, their wiring is done one way at the mitigation board, and other brands like Train, Carrier, Tempstar, some of those, it's done a slightly different way at the board. Again, nothing hard, nothing earth-shattering, just a little bit different from what we do today, and a little bit different from certain manufacturers to other manufacturers. So bottom line is make sure you break out the installation manual, look at that low voltage wiring schematic and diagram. The manufacturer's manuals I've seen, they've done a wonderful job of making it very easy to follow how to do the low voltage wiring. And you just need to make sure that we connect it, correctly.
Oh, great breakdown. We appreciate that. So, Anthony, there's been so much wonderful information that you've been able to break down for us in this episode. We're going to conclude with the last question. How is Righttek helping contractors prepare for the shift?
Well, great question. We have been doing a lot of training around this topic for the last 18 to 20 months now. I have traveled all over different parts of the country and in the Mid-Atlantic extensively, as far as Texas, even doing trainings on this. We've also done a lot of training with ACA, Air Conditioning Contractors of America, in a webinar-based format, and we have literally trained, contractors and their technicians and installers from all over the country with that platform as well. So lots and lots of training, both in person and webinar based. And we're very hopeful and optimistic that most companies and contractors are kind of up to speed now, or at least they're very quickly getting acclimated, because we're all kind of baking in the heat now going into July. It's gotten pretty hot across the country, and with the lack of 410A systems still hanging around in most distributors' inventories, you're almost forced into the new A2L. So we're very optimistic, very hopeful. But if you haven't gotten to training, I highly recommend that you reach out, to some trusted entity. Get some training from your manufacturer through your distributors, but get some knowledgeable folks to help you get up to speed on what you really need to know and do out there in the field, just to make sure that you and your technicians, installers are all safe.
Appreciate you guys working so hard and trying to train up everybody and get everybody acquainted with what's going on. And we appreciate your efforts to the community.
Absolutely. Well, we appreciate you having us on the podcast as always. We're very hopeful that this has been or will be something that's beneficial to some of your membership there. And if we can ever do anything further, please do let us know.
Definitely will do. Well, thanks everyone so much for listening to this episode. Make sure you tune into the next one. Until next time.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Blueprint Boost for Contractors. We hope you found today's insights and strategies valuable for your contracting business. If you enjoyed the episode, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and please leave us a review. Your feedback helps us bring content that truly matters.